Well, a while back, I had the privilege of getting to spend a week or so in New York City with a mission team. We were visiting a pastor that I used to do ministry with in a former church, and he had left that church to go plant a church in New York City. And so we took a team up there to visit him and to help his congregation. And I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and all of my family, my parents, my extended family, are from rural West Tennessee, farmlands, middle of nowhere. And so one of the aspects that I learned pretty quickly when visiting New York City, when seeing this big city, is the understanding of just how big it really is. It's the Big Apple, but it is a big, big city. You think you know what you're getting into when you go, because you've seen it in all the movies and you've read about it in books. Like New York City, everybody knows about it. There's all the different sites and tourist attractions and things to do. But when you get there, it is so much bigger than you could have ever imagined. And you get there and you start trying to navigate your way around, and it's like this labyrinth of buildings and streets and intersections. And if you take a wrong turn, you're going to find yourself in the middle of a street, which means you're going to find yourself in the middle of your back, flattened by a taxi cab. And so left to yourself with no help, it is very easy to get lost and to find yourself even in dangerous places. And so what we found that we needed in order to navigate a big city like NYC is that you actually only need a couple of things. The first thing you need is a map. You need a map of the city. The second thing that you need, not just a map, you need a marker to figure out where you currently are on that map. And then third, you need to know your destination so that you can navigate from where you are now at your marker to where you want to go. And if you have all three of those things, then you can pretty much get anywhere that you want to go in the city. And the thing is the fastest way around New York City is not by car, it's by subway. And all throughout New York City, there are subway tunnels, and in these subway tunnels are maps that tell you where you are, and they tell you the train routes that will get you to where you want to go. They provide this aerial view of the city where you're looking from the sky down on the trams so that you can see the whole landscape of the city and plan your route from there. And they have little markers on the maps that say, you are right here. You are at this station. Here's all the trains that connect to this one. And here's all the ways that you can go from here. And some of the maps even gave you like the best routes to get to all of the tourist attractions, like the Bull on Wall Street and things like that. And so what's even better than these maps in the subway station is we live in this world where a great, wonderful thing exists called Google Maps. And it's all of that in one. It tells you exactly where you are at all times. It can give you a whole map of the city, and you can ask it where you want to go, and it will tell you where you need to go. And so with these things, a map, a marker, and our destination, we were able to get to all of the places that we wanted to go visit in New York City. The landmarks and the stores that we wanted to see, to the restaurants that we wanted to eat at, to the airport that we were supposed to fly out of, because there's two in New York City. And most importantly, it helped us figure out the subway routes so we could get around to those places even faster. And the reason that I'm telling you this story is because in order to unlock the Old Testament, you need the same thing. The Old Testament is like a big, huge city like New York City. It's a labyrinth of literature. And if you don't have your bearings within the story of the Old Testament, and if you don't know where you're trying to go with what you're reading, you can get lost in the Old Testament pretty easily. But just like navigating a big city, you really only need these three things in order to navigate the story of the Old Testament. You need a map. You need to know and be able to grasp the whole landscape or the whole story of the Old Testament. You need a marker. When you open up to a passage in the Old Testament and you just start reading, maybe you just open up to the book of Jeremiah and you pick chapter 27, where am I? At this point in time in history, at this point in the story, in the narrative that's taking place, where am I right now? And finally, you need a destination. You need to know where the Old Testament is ultimately headed. And so what I want to do tonight is to give these resources to you. I want to give you a map of the Old Testament story. I want to give you a marker to help you find your place in the story. And I want to give you the destination of where the Old Testament story is ultimately taking you to. So here we go. First thing that you need is a map of the Old Testament's story. The Old Testament really is a story. It's one big story. It's not just a random collection of Sunday school stories that are all just sort of connected together by a bunch of lists that say begat over and over. It really does tell one single unified story. And just like a map of New York City, you can take a step back from the Old Testament and look at it from this 50,000-foot aerial view, and you can see that there is a real design. You can really see the cohesiveness of how these stories fit together. And that might seem like a really basic point to make, but it's really, really important that we grasp it. It's an important point because many people believe that the Old Testament isn't a real story in that sense. And when you really think about what the Old Testament is, you can understand why people would believe that. Because, first of all, the Old Testament is not technically one book. It is 39 different books with 24 different authors written on 2 different continents over a 1,000-year span. Think about that. When you read the Old Testament, you are hearing stories told by 24 different human voices, some of whom lived on totally separate continents from one another, and they lived centuries apart from one another. And what that means is that most of them did not know each other in person, and certainly did not coordinate with one another as they were writing the books that comprise the Old Testament. And so you can see how those details lead to the conclusions that some skeptics come to about the Old Testament. Here's a few skeptics. Richard Dawkins, a famous atheist, said, "To anyone with an understanding of how texts evolve over time, the Bible is clearly a hodgepodge of different authors with competing agendas." Christopher Hitchens, another famous atheist, "The Old Testament is, at best, a crude anthology of tribal myths and oral traditions, shaped by countless hands and designed to enforce the authority of the priesthood." Bart Ehrman, who grew up as a Christian and later became a critic of the Bible, "The Old Testament wasn't written by Moses or any single person. It's a collection of documents written over centuries by different people, often with different theologies and agendas." And the problem with all of these critiques of the Old Testament is this: their starting point is correct. There's multiple authors over long periods of time, It's multiple different books. There's different geographical locations that they're writing from. But their conclusion of how that works together couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, it is the reality that the Old Testament was composed by so many different authors in so many different places over so much time, but it is still actually cohesive and tells one unified story. That is what makes the Old Testament so amazing in the first place. So, what is that story? What is the story of the Old Testament? Well, we can summarize it in 4 statements. This is our map. First statement is this: the Old Testament is a story about one God. The primary character in the Old Testament is God. And the first verse of the Old Testament introduces us to the main character of the text. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, who? God created the heavens and the earth. But the remarkable thing is that the story continues to be all about Him all the way through. The God that you read about in Genesis as He creates the world, as He places Adam and Eve in the garden, as He brings a curse upon mankind because of sin, as He causes a worldwide flood to happen because of that sin, as He calls Abraham to covenant this is the same God who also then later in the next book redeems the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, who in the book of Isaiah appears in all of His glory and majesty in heaven to His prophet. This is the same God who calls Jonah to preach to the Ninevites, and so on and so forth. He is the same God with the same characteristics, acting in the same way, with the same covenant name, Yahweh, throughout the whole Old Testament. So the Old Testament is a story about one God. It is also a story about one people. In the beginning of the story, God creates one man and one woman, and then the population of the earth spreads out from there, but evil spreads with it. And so in Genesis 6 through 9, we see God wiping out all of mankind except for Noah and his family. And then out of Noah's lineage comes Abraham, whom God promises to make into a great nation. And out of that promise, the entire rest of the story of the Old Testament unfolds. Because the rest of the story of the Old Testament focuses on this one nation that comes from Abraham's family. It's his descendants who become the people of Israel, God's covenant people. It is this one people of God that God continues to commit Himself to through covenant relationship. And He establishes them as a nation in the land that He gives to them. He wins their battles for them. He gives them the law through the Mosaic covenant. He promises an eternal kingdom in His Davidic covenant. And then He promises ultimate restoration and redemption through the new covenant. All of this happens in the Old Testament as the one covenant God reveals Himself and interacts with His one covenant people. The Old Testament is also a story about one conflict. Like any good story, conflict is at the very center of the Old Testament. The conflict is introduced right at the beginning. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. I will put enmity between you, talking to Satan, and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And this conflict between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent continues to play out throughout the entire Old Testament. We have Cain and Abel, Noah and the evil inhabitants of the earth, Jacob and Esau, the Israelites and the Egyptians, David and Goliath, Elijah, the prophets of Baal. The problem, though, is that while we see in the Old Testament the seed of the woman, the good guys, winning some small victories over the seed of the serpent, the bad guys, ultimately, in the Old Testament, it seems like the seed of the serpent wins out. He tempts God's people over and over, and he appears to win the battles. Moses, the great man of God, and the Israelites, they grumble in the wilderness. They receive God's judgment. David gives in to temptation and receives God's discipline because of his sin with Bathsheba. The people of God in the promised land commit idolatry and sexual immorality over and over, and they become the object of God's displeasure and his wrath, so much so that he extends the other nations of the world like Assyria and Babylon to come and judge his own people for their sins and to bring them into exile. That is how, really, the story of the Old Testament ends. But these failures by God's people really just expose the problem that goes all the way back to Genesis 3 that was already built into their relationship with God from that point over. Even in the best of times in Israel's history, when they were living in the land, when they were serving God as they were supposed to, when there were righteous kings who followed in the footsteps of their father David, the conflict with sin cast a shadow over their relationship with God. You have to even think about how God instructed his people to worship him. Something pure and holy and righteous like worshiping and communing with God still required in the temple sacrifice for sin. There were constant sacrifices to atone for their sin. It included the reminder of the necessity that there needed to be a mediator, the high priest, the only person who could go in and enter into God's presence in the Holy of Holies. And he could only do that one time a year, as Leviticus 16 teaches us. So it becomes painfully obvious that God's people are broken and they are condemned by their sin, and this sin is not something that they can remedy on their own. Every time we see a new hero enter the story, like Moses or David or Samson or you name it, every time a hero shows up in the Old Testament, if you don't know how it all ends and you're reading it for the very first time, you might think, is this the one? Is this the one who's going to finally end the battle and win once and for all? And every single time, they fall into sin. It wasn't them. It was not these heroes. But that leads us to the final aspect of the unified story of the Old Testament. It's a story about one plan of redemption. From Genesis 3:15 onwards, we see that God is unfolding one single plan of redemption. It's through the seed of the woman. He would redeem his people from sin. He would reverse the effects of the curse. And what we see happening all through the Old Testament is God preserving the family line through whom the seed of the woman would come. From Adam to Noah, through Abraham, through Judah, through David, and then ultimately leading up to the birth of his own son, Jesus Christ. In the Old Testament, we see God unfolding one single plan of redemption, one generation at a time. We see God directing and orchestrating all of human history towards this one specific baby born in a manger that we're going to celebrate here in Christmas soon, Jesus of Nazareth. This is why Jesus said what he said to the Pharisees about the Old Testament. In John 7:39 through 40, he said, "You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. And it is they that bear witness about me. Yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life." So even though the Old Testament is composed of 39 different books with 24 different authors from 2 different continents written over 1,000 years, it tells a single unified story about God, about his people, about our cosmic conflict with sin and Satan, and about, ultimately, the redemption that Jesus Christ will bring. This is actually, contrary to what we heard from those skeptics, this is actually an incredibly compelling and amazing argument for the divine authorship of the Old Testament. How else could such a scattered compilation of books produce such one perfect unified story? If we had a book today that was written by 39 different chapters with 24 different people writing those chapters, written over even just a decade, we would find contradictions in a book like that. But this book is unique. It is remarkable. And so it also means, because the Old Testament is one unified story, it means that the Old Testament does have this map. It means that it does have a design that if you take a step back from and you look at as a whole, then you can find your place in it. So we have the map. We have this 10,000-foot aerial view of the story of the Old Testament, but you need more than just the map. Remember, you also need a marker. You need a tool that can help you find your place on the map when you just open up to a random passage. You need something that's the equivalent of the "you are here" arrow, right? Where am I? I'm reading in the book of Ezekiel. Where am I? What's happening? What time period am I in? What's going on in the nation of Israel? Well, that's our second resource. We need a marker for the Old Testament story. So I want to give you a tool, a basic tool that can help you figure out where you are in the Old Testament story at any point when you are reading it. So this is something that you can quickly glance at to just kind of be reminded of the overall story of the Old Testament, so that when you're reading it, you can kind of get your bearings of where you are in general. And it's actually just one word. It's Kings. So it's an acronym, KINGS, and it's an acronym that you can use to remember the entire story of the Old Testament, to look at the entire map in one glance. So what is that? Well, the first is the K. It's the kickoff and rebellion. This is the book of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11. This is God creating the universe. This is the fall into sin. This is the flood to judge that sin. And there's a covenant that takes place, 2 covenants really that take place in this section. God's covenant that he makes with Adam, where he charges him to rule over the earth. And he makes a covenant with Noah after the flood that God will never destroy the earth again by water. And so this really takes us all the way back to the beginning of time. Then after that, Genesis chapter 12 fast forwards just a little bit from Noah, and it takes us to the time where Abraham is called to be an instrument of blessing to the nations. God makes a covenant with Abraham, and he says that whoever curses Abraham would be cursed by God, but whoever blesses Abraham would be blessed by God. And Abraham, by being faithful to the Lord, by believing the Lord, by trusting in him, would be a blessing to the nations. God makes these promises to Abraham around the year 2000 BC. After that, the nation of Abraham grows. It expands through the patriarchs, his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and then, you have the story of Joseph and his brothers, and that leads into the book of Exodus, where God redeems the nation of Israel out of slavery. So he orchestrates the Exodus. He sends the 10 plagues upon Egypt. Moses leads the people out of Egypt through the Red Sea and into the wilderness. And they're supposed to walk just from the wilderness, from the other side of the Red Sea, into the land of Canaan, and it will all be good and happy and joyful, and they'll get the land, and that's it. But we know from reading what happens. They grumble, they complain, they get scared of the inhabitants of the land, and so God punishes them by making that generation wander in the wilderness for 40 years. During this time, God also gives Moses the law. So the second half of the book of Exodus, Leviticus, parts of Numbers, most of Deuteronomy is known as the Mosaic Law. God makes a covenant with his people and says, if you will keep this law, then you will get to live in the land that I am giving you. But if you break this law, you will end up being exiled out of the land. The Exodus took place in the year 1446 BC. So that's about 500-ish years after Abraham. Once the people stop their wanderings and they march into Canaan, we end up in the book of Joshua. Joshua is when they take over the land of Canaan, they establish the government in the land, and God sets up judges to govern and rule over the people of Israel as they seek to follow Moses' law. And this time of governance takes place from a few years after the Exodus, or at least 40 years after the Exodus, up until about the time of David and Solomon. David is reigning around the year 1000 BC. And the books in the Old Testament that cover this time period are Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and most of 2nd Kings, and 1st and most of 2nd Chronicles. And during this time, as the people are living in the land, God makes his covenant with David. And he says, David, if you will follow after me, then I will set up a king on your throne who comes from your family, who will sit on this throne and rule my people Israel forever and ever. He's prophesying about Jesus. But if you know the story of the Old Testament in big picture, you know that that's not what ends up happening right away. The rest of the books of Kings and Chronicles are about how the people fall into idolatry. They fall into sin. They are ultimately judged by God and sent into exile. They are scattered into exile. The northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed by the Assyrians and taken off into captivity in 722 BC. So not even 300 years after David is reigning on the throne. And then the southern kingdom of Judah they hold on a little longer, but they are ultimately destroyed and carried off into captivity by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And that is when the temple in Jerusalem is first destroyed. So in the Old Testament, the books that correspond to this time period are the end of 2nd Kings, the end of 2nd Chronicles. And then, after the people are let go of exile, the Lord redeems them, he restores them, he gathers them back into Israel, he brings them home, and the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther all correspond to that. So how does having this marker of this acronym help you to understand like where you are? Well, here's an example. I'm currently studying through the book of Isaiah. And so before I begin reading a passage in Isaiah, I take a moment and I think about where am I on this map? I am in really the gathering or the scattering and the gathering part of the Old Testament story. Isaiah is writing right up at the time of the exile starting to happen. God's people have been judged by God. They're being sent into exile into Assyria and Babylon. And so knowing that gives me some context of the Old Testament story, and it helps me make sense when I read a passage like Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. We read this all the time at Christmas. It's a passage that we love to read because it gives us hope. It helps us to think about who Jesus is and the wonderful things that he's done. But when you have the context in your mind that God's people have sinned, they've been kicked out of their land, they've been judged, and God is bringing them back home. He's restoring the promises to them. He said, I have not let you go. I am going to redeem you. You will be restored. It brings a passage like this to life. There will be no gloom for her who waits in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he's made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan. The Israelites were coming from east of the Jordan, back west into the land of Israel, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in a land of deep darkness, in captivity in Babylon and Assyria, on them light has shone. You've multiplied the nation. They were destroyed. They were killed off. There was just a few of them left. But God says, you've multiplied the nation. You've increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest. And they're glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken on the day of Midian. God has released them from captivity in exile. And every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. How's this happen? For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. The government shall be upon his shoulder, not the king of Babylon, not Nebuchadnezzar. His name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David, over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So if we do a quick check on our map, where's the marker? We remember that Isaiah wrote this when God's people were facing exile. They were in exile. They were under God's judgment, under the oppressive rule of a rival pagan nation, with their homelands decimated and their temple burned to the ground. When you have that context in the back of your mind, it brings a passage like this to light. It's so much more than if you just read it as an encouraging devotional for the morning. It tells you how amazing and how powerful God is to redeem an entire nation of people from such horrendous darkness. And if he can do that for all of them, he can do it for you too, through his son. This is a prophecy of restoration for God's people. And a day will come when God is going to fulfill this prophecy in an even greater way through his son. And he will restore the fortunes of his people. He'll reestablish his people, and it's going to happen through his promised Redeemer. So that's a tool that you can use, is this KINGS acronym. Now, I know, though, that it seems like memorizing an acronym with a whole lot of details to remember that we just went through, that can be kind of scary, right? You're studying for a test or something. No, don't worry. How are we going to learn all of this? Well, we can actually take a lesson from our subway surfing friends in New York City. So if you talk to New Yorkers, the people that live there, and they take the subway every single day, one of the really remarkable things that you'll notice about these people is that they have the entire subway system, where the trains are going, what times the stops are, how they need to do it. They have it all memorized. They know the maps and the train times like the backs of their hands. Well, how did they do that? It's a lot. Well, they are immersed in it. They live it every single day. They had to start somewhere. At one point, they didn't have it all memorized. They didn't know it. But as they rode the trains each day, and they learned their way around the city and where these trains were taking them, and they looked at these maps as they passed by them in the tunnels over and over and over, eventually it started sticking. And the map just carved its way into their brain. And now when you talk to them, they can get anywhere without any help. They don't have to look at the map. They don't have to look at the schedules. They just know. And really, the same can actually be true of you with the Old Testament. One of the reasons why people have so much difficulty understanding it is because they see the complexity of the Old Testament. Remember, like this subway map, like our 39 books with 24 authors. They see that complexity and they just give up. But if you actually just read a little bit in the Old Testament day by day, and maybe you reference a map while you do it, maybe the King's acronym, maybe an actual atlas, eventually you'll be like one of those New Yorkers. You can navigate your way around the Old Testament just like they can get around the city. If you immerse yourself in the Old Testament and don't just read a story and then bounce off of it and head back to the New Testament, and you use things like this King's acronym or a good study Bible or a Bible atlas for a while, eventually your understanding of the Old Testament will carve its way into your own heart, and you'll be able to know where you are when you open up to a random passage in 1 Kings. But even though this King's acronym, I think, is a really good tool that you can use as a marker to help you navigate the Old Testament, you still need more. You still need one more thing. To truly navigate the Old Testament, you also need to know where this story is taking you. You need a destination. Recently, I was in Dallas last year for a conference, and I was picking up a rental car from Enterprise. And I saw this placard on the desk of the Enterprise check-in station, and it said in gigantic, obnoxious, bold letters, when returning your car, do not use Apple Maps. It will take you to the wrong place. Put in this address instead. And last year, when I was in Dallas at this Enterprise, I didn't believe them. Apple Maps has never steered me wrong. And so when the conference was over and I was heading back to the airport, I ended up driving around in circles for a while. So this year, that conference was in Dallas again, and I got a car from Enterprise, and when it said, use this address instead, I took a picture of it, I wrote it down in my notes, I texted it to myself, I emailed it to myself, and when it came time to return that car, I put that address in, and guess what? I got there. So, I don't know what the moral of that story is. Maybe don't trust Apple Maps. But it's true. When you know what the actual destination is, you will get to where you are going. You can have the right map. You can even have a marker on the map. But if you don't have the correct destination input, you're going to end up in the wrong place. And the same thing is true with the Old Testament. That was the issue, really, with the Pharisees that Jesus rebuked. They knew the map of the Old Testament like the back of their hand. They could even open up any passage and know the marker, where they were standing as they were reading that passage, but they didn't understand the destination, and so they ended up in the wrong place. And that's why Jesus rebukes them. So this leads us to our last resource, the destination of the Old Testament story. Have you ever read a really good book where each chapter ends on a cliffhanger? That feeling that you get even when the story's like almost complete and it's a really good story and it leaves you hungry for more and you just want to keep reading. You're like, I got to know where this goes. Who, if it's a murder mystery, who did it? I got to know. A couple of months ago, I was reading through Treasure Island with my two oldest boys. We were getting ready for Glow Camp Shipwrecked edition, so we had to read a pirate book. And we were reading this abridged version of it, and whoever this editor was that abridged Treasure Island down to the copy that we had was a genius, because every single chapter ended up on a cliffhanger. Every night we would read before bed, and every night it left my kids like craving for more. They're like, Dad, what's going to happen to Jim Hawkins? They want to know what happens to Long John Silver. Well, when you get to the end of the Old Testament story, you get the same sense. The story ends with the gathering of God's people back into Jerusalem. Exile is over. They are restored to their land. But when you read the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, when you read some of the minor prophets like Zechariah and Haggai, there is a certain dissatisfaction that the people feel. They look at this new temple that they've rebuilt, and it's nothing like the glory of the old temple that was destroyed. Things aren't how they should be. The former glory of the temple hasn't been restored. They're broken and ravaged by sin. They're still under the thumb, really, of surrounding nations. They're more of a puppet kingdom than their own state. And they're still waiting for this promised Messiah who hasn't seemed to come yet. And we see this expectation at the very end of the Old Testament story. At Malachi 3, 1 through 4, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he's coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he's like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord as in the days of old and as in former years." God, we're back in the land. We've rebuilt the temple. We're doing the things again. We're following the law, but we're still not there yet. There's still something wrong. We're still waiting for you to do something even more grand. This is the cliffhanger at the end of the Old Testament. As we reach the end of the Old Testament story, we're meant to wonder, how is God going to fulfill his promise that he made all the way back in Genesis 3:15? How is God going to remove the curse and bring in his blessings? Why does the story of the Old Testament leave us with all these questions? Well, the reason is because it's taking us to a destination that is beyond the Old Testament itself. And that destination is, of course, Jesus Christ. Jesus is the ultimate destination of the Old Testament story because Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the Old Testament's expectations and all of the promises that God made to his people. The Old Testament, at the end of the day, is just the prequel to the even grander story of Jesus. We see this in 1 Corinthians 1:20. "For all the promises of God find their yes in him." That's Jesus. That's why it is through him that we utter our amen to God for his glory. We also see it in Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. "When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons." This is the last key that will help you unlock the Old Testament story. We should always read the Old Testament in light of Christ, because the story of the Old Testament ultimately climaxes in his person and in his work. He's the ultimate destination. And so as we're reading the Old Testament, one question that we can ask that will help us get our bearings is this: how is this passage leading me to Jesus? How does the longing that I feel by reading this passage get fulfilled in Christ? How does Jesus restore what is broken in this passage in the Old Testament? We're going to talk a lot more about that in a later class when we talk about how to unlock Christ in the Old Testament. But for now, my hope is just this, that you'd be able to take these three resources, the map of the Old Testament, the marker of where you are when you're reading, and knowing the destination that the Old Testament leads to, and that you'll be able to use them to help you start navigating where you are in the Old Testament as you read it each day. So I want to close by making this last appeal to you. Don't neglect learning and knowing and living in the story of the Old Testament. Yes, it is going to take some time and some energy and some investment to learn and to navigate it. That's why I've wanted to give you some tools tonight. There's other great tools that are out there. There's study Bibles, there's commentaries, there's Bible atlases. There's even books like the one that we're recommending for this class, Enjoying Jesus' Bible. I think there's a couple more that I put on your handout that will help you do that. But you can also talk to your pastors. If you don't know where to start, talk to one of your pastors, and we'd love to help you know where you are and how you can start navigating the story of the Old Testament. So yeah, it's going to be hard work. It's 2/3 of your Bible. It's a massive, huge story, but it will be worth it. It will be worth it because these stories are powerful. These stories shape us. They point us to Jesus. It's worth it because these stories are true. These stories are part of the Bible. They are God's words to you about the world that you live in. This is real history. We are here today because of the things that took place in the Old Testament. And so don't neglect it. The Old Testament reveals our great God. The Old Testament reveals our great conflict that we have with sin, and it ultimately reveals and points forward to God's great solution in Jesus Christ. So if we want to understand the Old Testament story, we have to know what kind of story it is. And we read different stories in different ways. You don't treat a mystery novel like it's a nonfiction biography, right? So how does knowing what kind of literature each book of the Old Testament is, how does that help us understand its place, each book's place in the grand story of the Old Testament? Well, I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger and say you've got to come back next week to find out the answer to that with Pastor Richard. So let me pray. And if you have any questions, I'll be hanging out up here at the front. I'd love to get to know you and answer any questions you have. But let's pray and ask the Lord to help us as we go.